E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā iwi, e rau rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Ko Sue Bidrose tōku ingoa, I am the Chief Executive of AgResearch. In my previous life, actually, I was the Chief Executive of Dunedin City Council. So this feels like all my Christmases have come at once, two of my favourite groups of people in the room at the same time. So thank you for the kind invitation. So the topic of my speech was to be the science system for the next 30 years. In fact, in your menus, that is still the topic of my speech, because we all anticipated by now that Cabinet will have met and made some decisions about the science system for the next 30 years. That Cabinet meeting was supposed to happen yesterday and it got bumped, which means that I have absolutely nothing to say. Any questions? Short presentation. So I've had to scramble yesterday with the man saying, if I don't have your presentation by lunchtime, I will get very grumpy. So I will talk you through something a bit different, but I will come back to the science reforms. I will talk a bit about AgResearch, who we are, what we do, the science of, because quite a lot of it interfaces with a lot of what you do, and it's a very strongly changing landscape. The wider science system, but also what's happening in the CRIs and in our CRI. So I thought I'd give you a quick update on that. I've got a lot of slides, but mostly I'll flick through them fairly quickly. Then I'd introduce you briefly to the whole group of the CRIs and Callaghan, which is kind of a sister agency. And then I'll come back to the current science system review, and I'll talk a little bit about what we think might be going to happen and why we think that. And then I think what's going to happen is then we'll have our other presenters, and then we'll all come up and sit here and take questions more generally. But if you've got anything really pressing or you feel like I've missed a trick, feel free to stick your hand up, and if I see, or holler, if I see or hear you, then I'm happy to take questions as we go. So in terms of AgResearch, I began my working career at AgResearch in quite a while ago. I'm older than I look. It was a long time ago. As a lab technician, a very bad one. And some of the people that I worked with in the late 70s and early 80s are actually still at AgResearch. I think they were probably quite surprised to see that it was me that returned as chief executive. However, I did run a very good social club, which I think is probably a better skill set to fit you to be a chief executive than being a lab technician. We've been in our shape, roughly, AgResearch, since about 1990. In fact, when I worked for one of the predecessor organisations, it was Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries. And there was a big wholesale change in 89, 90. There was quite a lot more change in the early 2000s, and there's about to be, and it's been pretty consistent since then, but there is about to be another big round of change imminently. So our purpose was written in 2010 by MB, and it kind of keeps us grounded. Probably if I was writing it today, I'd make it a bit less wordy. It's not exactly pithy, but it does capture what we're here for. And each of the CRIs has one of these, which the intent is we're all companies, and so our job is to maximise return for our own company, for our own sector, to keep ourselves going. And the intent of the core purpose statement should be to stop us straying into each other's lanes, and mostly it does. There's definitely some grey areas at the edges, but basically that's where we focus, and for us it's predominantly the pastoral agricultural sector, although we do have science that covers the whole value chain from farm to plate. That's where we scattered, so 4 major campuses, including here in beautiful Palmerston North. And I'd have to say, is there anyone here from Hamilton? Block your ears. I visit Palmerston and I visit Hamilton a lot for my job. Palmerston's really grown on me. That's really all I would say. Actually, I'm really lucky. We've got 4 great campuses, a little bit out of Dunedin, and Dunedin is one of my first loves as a city, and head offices in Christchurch and Canterbury. And then, of course, we have all of those farms as well, which are somewhat associated with the nearest campus. The farms themselves are an interesting challenge as we, as an organisation, try to manage our own carbon footprint. Certainly our biggest carbon cost is our farms, but it doesn't seem very wise. The quickest thing we could do to decarbonise as an agency would be to have no farms, but that doesn't seem entirely wise for us or for our science. And I think Alec who's in the crowd somewhere, has been arguing, please don't sell more farms. We've run at a loss pretty much every year since we were invented, because science is expensive and our sector generally doesn't want to spend a whole lot of money if it doesn't have to. And so we run at a loss, and every now and then we've sold a farm to make good the difference. It's really good that we've stopped doing that, I think, because we're a bit down to our bare minimum. In terms of the size, we've got about 700 or 800 people working for us. About just over 3/4 of those are actually people who are actually doing the science, and about 1/4 of the people who keep the business of the business running. Turnover is about $180 million a year worth of science, and in fact across the CRIs as a whole we do about $1 billion worth of science a year for New Zealand, and primarily with New Zealand's best interest in mind. For us, of that 180 million, about 40% of it is commercial work, and that means commercial work with commercial stakeholders like Fonterra, Beef and Lamb, some of the sponsors that I saw on the list here actually. And we have about 500 science projects on the go at any given point in time. In terms of the context for agricultural science, you can see there some of those key challenges. This comes out of the MPI Situation and Outlook for Primary Industries report that came out in June. So there's a lot going on in terms of that broader context that's influencing the fortunes of the sector, and often that have made farming quite difficult or financially challenging. And that sector economic performance has a direct result on us. Over the last few months, 54% of our stakeholders have indicated that there's a financial barrier to them in engaging in further research activity, and that's concerning to me. Judith Collins is the Minister of Science and Technology, and she has said a number of times that in her mind New Zealand has an incredibly good agricultural or primary sector system, and it's built on the back of great science. We do a whole lot of work in the area of life cycle analysis, and the stuff that we produce on a plate in London or in a house in England tends to have a lower carbon problem than stuff that they can get from a farm just up the road in their own country, largely because of the way we farm, and some of the innovative practices that have been led out of New Zealand. A lot of those have improved farming across the world, but I have no doubt that innovation and agri-tech very much are the future of keeping the agricultural industry in New Zealand at the forefront of world leading innovative practice. And a lot of that comes out of our scientists in collaboration with scientists around the world, across our university sectors, and sometimes in the other CRIs as well. And some of that science will be science that I'm sure quite a few of you use in your own work. When we were thinking, so although I don't have a lot to tell you yet about what the government are going to actually do, I can tell you about some of the drivers for what they want to do. And some of those drivers have also been driving us in recent years. So a couple of years ago, there was a sense out of Wellington, it was really time for us, all of the CRIs, to be looking at our science priorities. We had quite a number of projects that had been being funded. In terms of our funding, we get about $40 million a year from MB. It's not a grant. They use that to buy science. So that is, they have quite a lot of impact over and say over what science we are and aren't doing with that money. And they came to us and they felt like it's called our SIF money. They felt like our SIF projects were a bit stale. They wanted a whole lot of refreshing. There'd been things that had been receiving SIF for far too long, and if they weren't commercially viable now, they were never going to be. And they asked us to do a really sizable refresh of what we were spending our SIF on, which we've just done and just delivered. And the new project started on the 1st of July, and I'll quickly whip you through what they look like. The challenges of that, but because we haven't had an inflation adjustment from government since 2002, the challenges, so we all of the CRIs, that's not just AgResearch. So our government funding would be about double what it is now if we'd had that inflation adjustment. So that means year on year you get slightly less science for your same amount of money, although because our scientists are people who are primarily driven to do great science, they often try and do as much science, which means we secretly fund it in overheads, and you have all of those pretty standard problems that I think all the CRIs and universities face. What you're seeing as a result of that is a massive amount of passion within the science community, within AgResearch, within the CRIs, to tackle head-on the issues that being a primary sector-led economy really do create for us as a country, and a lot of those are issues that I know you're interfacing with as well. So when we thought about our own research priorities and what they should be, one of the first things we looked at were what our sector priorities were. And by that we mean both the primary sector and environmental stakeholder priorities. And these are the things that came up, and I think a fair few of those you would look at and think this is absolutely bang on target with where you're spending your time thinking as well. Climate change mitigation and adaptation, healthy waterways, biosecurity, and like mine. I think a lot of people think places like AgResearch, all we focus on is increasing productivity, and we certainly have done that at times. We spent a lot of time and energy on genetic improvements, breeding improvements, so that the same number of sheep would have twice as many lambs in a year, which increases profitability and yield and so on. But far more prevalent in our research now, by far the biggest portion of our research now is absolutely about how you can farm and at the same time minimise the impact, or in fact in many areas leave the environment in a better state than you were. And is that a possibility, and how would you get there? And what are the tools to do things like manage mitigation and nitrates in the waterways and so on? Great. Okay, so how we do the work, we're looking at those sector, I didn't make this slide, making those sector strategic priorities, and then looking at, we've done also a whole lot of work internally around where do we have world leading science? You know, we've got about 500 science staff. They cannot be every one of them cannot be world leading, and every one of them, we can't lead the world in every single area of science that's relevant to our sector. And so it's been a really close look of where do we have world leading scientists, and we definitely do. And where do we have New Zealand leading scientists, and we definitely do. And then what are those sector strategic priorities? And then what is that overlap in designing those research projects that sit in that sweet spot of it, which is it's good for New Zealand and we can do it better than anybody else. And that's how we determine the work program, and how we determined where our new priorities out of SIF funding should come from. And this is the areas where we create our science impact. So that's the primary areas where we're focusing, trying to make a change. And there is absolutely no doubt for this government that if we're doing stuff that isn't going to have economic impact, we should stop. That's not to say that people talk in the science community, they talk about H1, H2 and H3 science, so things that's going to have an impact immediately right through to something that the foundational research that you need. I mean, we wouldn't be finding things that actually work to reduce methane today if somebody 30 years ago hadn't been studying archaea and wondering what they did. And so, you know, you need to do that longer term research as well between us and the university system, but then knowing that there is a path to impact, and the path to economic impact is the thing that we are being talked to by the current government at every available opportunity. So in terms of, you know, I put up the slides showing where we have deep international level and international leading expertise. That's the area where AgResearch in particular has got that key expertise: animal science, forage and microbial science, food and bioproducts, sustainability and environment, and most importantly that integrated farm systems approach, which hopefully when you work it together well goes across everything we do. So that's the new set of research priorities that the team came up with. I didn't come up with it. If your chief executive thinks they can write your science priorities, you're in a worrying organisation. Our chief scientist and our science strategy lead, so both scientists, have led a process talking right across the whole organisation, because by saying, actually, here's our new 5 research priorities, what that has meant is there's some areas of science that have been getting SIF for quite a long time, some of them, and they won't be getting SIF anymore, which means we either stop doing that science or we have to find someone else to fund it. And some of that area is because it has less of an impact than sustainable pastoral ag in a changing climate. Probably nothing at the moment is as important as methane, and probably second is nitrates, animal welfare. all the sort of things you would imagine. Biosecurity always makes the top of the list. So when I think KPMG's annual agribusiness survey said farmers and the sector came back and said biosecurity was top of their list in terms of what was the most important. So that's our list, and now we're having to think about what we do about those areas that aren't getting funding, and some of them definitely we will be downsizing, to use a current horrible term, when it actually refers to people. And I think you've probably seen, we're public servants. Public service as a whole is in tightened financial circumstances at the moment, and you've seen some. Maybe 300 science staff across the 7 CRIs announcing reductions in the size of their science workforce because funding is static and the cost of science isn't, and how we manage that is challenging, and every scientist that you lose is deeply worrying. Most of them either retire because they're that age, or they immediately go and get a job in Australia or Canada or Europe or somewhere else, which is great for the science, but not so good for New Zealand's unique, more fairly unique pastoral ag system. A whole lot of things like for methane, there's some tools that are just on the market that are useful. They're really great if you have all of your animals in feedlots and you're feeding them every day, and you can add additives to your feedlots, but you can't add additives to pastures the same way. And so some of the solutions in New Zealand are going to be unique to us and a small number of other countries that predominantly pasture feed, which is why our own science system matters so much. I thought you might be interested. These are subsidiary companies that we own all or part of, and in terms of some of the ones that you guys interface with, FarmX, which is part of Farm IQ now, Overseer, water leaching and improvements to water quality. ZCal is genetic modification to add oil into. So there's a ryegrass that's currently been grown in Australia because it's genetically modified, so we can't grow it here. Excuse me. It's been grown in Australia, small quantities, because even in Australia it has to be grown and contained. It's been turned into silage, and at the moment it is being fed to sheep. And I understand some results just came through that indicate it did do what we thought it would do, which it did in the artificial rumen, which is reduce methane from the rumens of those animals. ZCal is effectively using the same technology to put oil into a whole lot of human food in America, which obviously we can't do here. But one of the benefits of putting the oil into the ryegrass in particular is that you also get faster weight gain. You get good health in the animals and stuff. This is one of the tools that's in the lead up to, is this going to be a useful thing in the methane space? And then Lucidome Bio is a new joint venture that we've just set up with AgResearch. It has about 7 or 8% of the AgResearch workforce is now seconded to work at Lucidome Bio, and they are looking at a methane vaccination. So it's a vaccination program, working their way through the various combinations of options they have to knock out the metabolic pathways of those critters in the rumen that cause the methane in your burps, not yours, hopefully, in cows' burps, and with a pathway to this this being a solution that will work in our environment. We also have a whole lot of other work in that methane space in terms of vaccinations, as well as genetically modified fodder and clover and ryegrass and so on. It's a big part of the work. So on that wider context, we're one of 7 Crown Research Institutes. The others are ESR. So they've got a strong health and forensics focus. They do water testing in the area of like COVID in the waterways, or I think they do all the testing to say, this is which city in New Zealand where most people are smoking pea, for example. Might be Palmerston North, actually. GNS look at New Zealand's geological and earth systems, so earthquakes and so on. They also look at energy resources, geothermal, oil and gas. Manaki Whenua, which focus on land, environment, biodiversity. NIWA, who look at aquatic resources, atmosphere, weather and hazards. Plant and Food have that same end-to-end value chain that we do, but in hort and grains. And Scion look at forestry, wood products and wood-derived biomaterials. And then we also work a lot quite closely with Callaghan, who are at that innovation and funding innovation end of the spectrum. And since, 4 years now, MB has been working on a reform of the CRIs. When I started, which was in 2020, the chair of the board said, look, I think there's about to be a massive restructure. I can only promise you work for a year. So now it's 2025. I'm probably still good for a year, or maybe not quite, I would say. In terms of why they've been doing all of these reviews, it would be fair to say the system was designed in the 80s for industry as it looked in the 80s. And if I'm honest, if I was setting up the CRI system today, I wouldn't make it look like it does now. There's glaring gaps. I think we've got about 60-odd AI projects underway at the moment. Plant and Food the same, NIWA the same. We're all doing work in this space, but there is no stewardship of that. Each of us is doing it entirely as set out in legislation for the benefit of our own company. AgResearch is a company that's duty-bound to make a profit, but also to serve the needs of its shareholder, which is Minister Collins. But none of that's coordinated. Nobody's saying, holy hell, if we've got 17 fab AI brains in the country, we want them working more on this and less on this. Like, nobody's doing that. It's each to our own. And that, I think, is a problem when you've got scarce resource and limited money. Lack of scale, 16 public science organisations, that's us and the 7 of us and Callaghan and the 8 universities. So 16 competing public organisations, all in one country of 5 million people, which is half the size of Paris, as I heard somebody say last week at another presentation where I was supposed to talk to them about what the government was going to change in the science system, and where I also had to make up other stuff. And certainly there's quite a lot talked about perceived duplication. I think the perceived duplication is probably a bit over-egged. I remember there was a meeting very early on in my time, and Minister Woods, Megan Woods, said to the assembled crowd of CRIs, which one of you does research on water? And we all put our hand up. And she said, oh, that is just so ridiculous. But actually, if you work it through, just NIWA does fishing, ESR does pee in the water, I do nitrate leaching. So just because I do nitrate leaching doesn't mean I should do pee. Pee drug, not urine, yeah. And I see you giggling. And doesn't mean I should do fishing, and doesn't mean, like, we've all got quite distinct parts of that system. But as I say, at the edges, there's definitely some overlap. I don't think duplication. Every now and then, out of central government, it gets put forward in briefings to the minister about it being a big problem. But I think we've really worked out it's a little issue, but it's tiny at the edges. And actually, having 2 groups of scientists from different institutions working on the same thing or closely aligned things isn't always a bad thing, actually, in terms of stretching their own thinking as well. But the competition definitely is not great. So, you can spend tens of thousands of dollars pulling together a really good grant application, and then you find out that for the money on offer, maybe it was a $2 million grant over 3 years, you've spent $50,000 on an application, and it turned out there were 300 people applying. That kind of thing is just very wasteful. And I know our scientists are incredibly resourceful. They'll use the same applications and tailor them for different markets and so on. But it's not a good system. It doesn't work well. And although we keep talking about these things as being a problem, the elephant is in the room is there is not enough money. And look, this is a refrain in every single part of the public sector. And as you might expect, it's very hard to argue that science should get more money when there's not enough money for hips, for hip replacements. But nothing shapes up to hip replacements. We could cut the science funding, actually, to be honest, and the only people that would really notice is you and my staff. But in 5 years' time, we'd really notice. And in 10 years' time, we'd be stuffed. Because keeping ahead of that innovation curve, keeping the science going here so that New Zealand is able to keep being thriving in that primary sector, until we've got a new exciting space industry that's $50 billion large and we can afford not to have ag, and I'm not entirely convinced that's going to happen in quickly, then keeping our primary sector thriving and viable, but at the same time making sure that it's not rooting the planet, has got to be a core part of what New Zealand sees as its core business. So the end is in sight. That's the good news. This year, Sir Peter Gluckman, he was the Prime Minister's first Chief Science Advisor, and he has worked with two panels. He's worked with the Science System Advisory Group to review the CRIs, and he's worked with the University Advisory Group to advise the government on the university science system. The reports were due in June for the first one, and in October for the second one. The first one, I think actually it was delivered not long after June, maybe July. I still haven't seen it, so it hasn't been released. And I think it's gone around government departments, but although we're owned by a government department, we're not a government department, so we're not treated that way. We just hear the rumours. But joyously, Business Desk, Dileepa, somebody who writes for Business Desk, published an article about what was in Sir Peter's report. And someone at MB rang me and said, okay, you're going to need to talk to your staff because somebody has leaked Sir Peter's report to Business Desk and they've written an article. And I said, am I allowed to share it with my staff? And they said, yes. So I told all the other CEs and I put it up on our website. And I was doing a blog, a live, I do them kind of every month or so, a live blog to our staff. So I purloined that opportunity to quickly run through with the staff. This is what I think is going to happen. This is what Sir Peter's recommending. And by the time I got off the blog, I had another phone call saying, actually, we don't think he does have a copy of the report. So, oh, too late. But actually, they were happy for us to share it. They said there's very little in that is wrong. So this isn't the cabinet paper. This is just what Sir Peter and his team recommended. So I'll quickly run you through what was in that report. Basically, it said that all 7 CRIs should be merged into a single entity that looks a little bit like A-Star in Singapore. And then he said that there is a need for a new innovation wing for some method, either a federation in that new big, it's called a PRO now, we're not allowed to call it a pro, but a PRO, Public Research Organisation, that one of the federations of science in there should focus on AI, advanced tech, quantum computing, some of that future-facing stuff that might be New Zealand. Maybe space. So space, I don't know what happens to space, but I know the minister's keen on the space industry. There would be a new Prime Minister's Science, Technology and Innovation Advisory Council run by the Prime Minister, also with the Treasurer, Minister of Science, I assume some other ministers, but chaired by the Prime Minister. Running it would be that the new Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor. So Juliet finished. Juliet came after Peter. She's finished, and they haven't yet appointed a replacement. But I think part of that is there is this recommendation from Sir Peter that there should be this politically, and the point of that is that group of advised people make decisions around how New Zealand's science budget gets spent. So what proportion should we spend on the primary sector and what proportion should we spend on health and so on? And then within that, I think the various, the science bodies make decisions about what the priorities are and where that ag dollars should then be focused and so on. And he also recommended, according to that article, that there be a new ministry for science and innovation, but no one's ever, instead of MB doing it, but no one's ever mentioned that again, so I'm not entirely sure they got any legs. The critical message really was that they wanted scientists to be able to more effortlessly collaborate, and I agree with that. At the moment it's a problem. There is definitely times, because money is tight, and because as I said, we don't get any core funding, right? So every bit of science we do, we have to basically make enough money to cover that quarter of the staff who are back office staff, the rent, how much it costs to own a farm, the depreciation, blah, 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 blah. Which means every bit of science is about, for us and the universities, is about twice as expensive as it is overseas, where that core funding is met by government. So A-Star, for example, where the core funding is given that meets all those overhead costs. Makes it very hard for us to take part in big international research consortia when our costs are immediately double what theirs are. because it isn't, we don't have the similar funder system. And I know right now Sir Peter is working, he has handed over report 1. There is a cabinet paper that says this is what we should and shouldn't do out of his report. I know that now he's working on the funding system as the next step. So how do we reform that competitive funding system that doesn't serve us well? And it's really odd at this point just to leave you hanging. But I must, because we thought this was going to be discussed at Cabinet yesterday. When I accepted the invitation to speak here, that was months away, and we were pretty sure we'd all know what was in the report, and I'd be able to tell you about how that was going and what it was looking like. I would say sometime in the next week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, it will be in the paper and you'll find out. And I'm hoping that I'll find out 2 minutes beforehand so I can let my staff know, but I'm not entirely convinced of that either for them that are sitting at the back. It takes new money. There's implications if there is none, and there is none in the short term, but with any luck we've got a government that actually do want to tackle It's Time for Change, that they've agreed to do this, and let's just see how we get through it. Thank you very much. Nice talking to you all.